Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Faculty Showcase presentation with Naomi Miller. Professor Miller teaches in the Department of English as well as the study of women and gender. Her teaching interests include Shakespeare, early modern women authors, lyric poetry of all periods, and children's literature. New courses that she has developed for the department include Shakespeares Sisters, representing women in the Renaissance, Shakespeare's Women, Women's Shakespeares, and Adapting Literary Classics for Children. In 2016, she was awarded Smith's Sherard Prize for Distinguished Teaching. Professor Miller's course on Shakespeare's Sisters focuses on Renaissance women writers who were long excluded from the literary canon. Her talk today shares how the course inspired her to change the canon outside the classroom in her own series of historical novels to introduce these extraordinary women to a wider public. So I am delighted to introduce Professor Naomi Miller.
I'm really happy to be here today. And as I said when I was getting ready for this talk, I feel like I've given versions of this talk to other reunions, my own reunions, was 40th reunion at Princeton, but I feel the most connected to a Smith audience, an audience of Smith alums, because my favorite students are hands down Smithies. And I think being a professor at Smith is actually the best job in the world. And so addressing all of you as alums about this topic is you're kind of my ideal audience, right? I want to talk to you about how many popular novels about Renaissance women, which there are a number, picture them in relation to powerful men. One example that probably some of you are familiar with is there are seemingly innumerable novels about one of the wives of Henry VIII. And there were plenty of wives, as you know, of Henry VIII. But having many, many novels, every year there are novels that come out about one of the wives of Henry VIII. And this perpetuates a phenomenon that I have named the Noah's Ark Approach, which positions women in dependent relation to famous men. Consequently, contemporary readers of historical fiction and biofiction being about actual historical figures, have missed out on an extraordinary array of women's voices that were heard in their own period, both acclaimed and reviled, but then silenced over time and excluded from the canon of accepted classics. The novel that I'm sharing with you today that I wrote, my debut novel, is called Imperfect Alchemist, and it launches a projected series called Shakespeare's Sisters in honor of Virginia Woolf, comprised of 6 interrelated historical novels that imagine the stories of early modern women authors from their own perspectives. These novels offer fictional engagements with an array of early modern figures, from queens to commoners. Historical women, including Mary Sidney Herbert, who's the protagonist of Imperfect Alchemist, are at the center of the narratives, bringing their voices and experiences to life for modern audiences. Shakespeare's Sisters, my series, centers on women whose lives and voices both shape and are shaped by women, many of whom appear in each other's stories. Spanning generations and social classes, the series paints a multi-hued portrait of Renaissance England, seen through the lives of courtiers, commoners, poets, playwrights, and above all, indomitable women who broke the rules of their time, while juggling many of the responsibilities and obstacles faced by women worldwide today. All the title characters in the series and many others are based on actual people, while invented characters add breadth and depth to their stories. In my Smith course, called by the same title, Shakespeare's Sisters, we explore the amazing range of writings published by women in the Renaissance and consider how these texts reflect and resist the social constraints under which women wrote. Imperfect Alchemist, the opening novel in the series, is an imaginative reinvention of the remarkable life of Mary Sidney Herbert, Countess of Pembroke, friend of Queen Elizabeth, visionary scientist, advocate for women writers, and scandalous lover of a much younger man. One of the earliest women authors in Renaissance England to publish under her own name, the Countess successfully forged a place for herself in a man's world. But before I tell you about that novel, I actually have another story for you about Mary Sidney Herbert's niece, Lady Mary Roth, who is the subject of my second novel, Secret Storymaker. Mary Roth published the first sonnet sequence and the first prose romance authored by an Englishwoman. When Roth published her sonnets and her prose romance in 1621, the immediate response from the male courtiers surrounding King James was, can you guess? Outrage. One courtier wrote a scathing letter attacking her for daring in her prose romance to, quote, maliciously slander his personal affairs, and including a poem to Pamphylia that addresses her as a hermaphrodite in show, indeed a monster. In a bold rebuttal, Roth responded that she was writing fiction, so any allegations of slander revealed more about the reader himself than any intent of the author, closing her letter with her own verse attack. Hermaphrodite in sense, in art a monster, your spiteful words against a harmless book show that an ass, much like the sire, doth look. So pretty amazing, right? In the 1600s, there's a woman referring to a male courtier in King James's court as an ass. So it's accurate to say that early modern women authors were subject to harassment and persecution. In Roth's case, her prose romance was withdrawn from publication in 1621. It was censored, so that the next published edition came out in 1996. That's basically 400 years of censorship of a single woman's work on the basis of her gender. Yet she kept on writing. And even more remarkably, the second part of Urania, which she continued after being ejected from the court for writing the first half, overturns all the male-authored prose romance traditions about happy ever after endings for young lovers in which the boy gets the girl, and moves on to treat the stories of mothers and grandmothers, and to trace how women's friendships with each other can support them, even in the face of inevitable infidelity by men. And so many of those prose romances are the stories of young lovers. Shakespeare based many of his early comedies, such as You Like It, on prose romances like this. Sidney's Arcadia, her uncle's book, was one of them. And there are no mothers and grandmothers, I can assure you, in the male author prose romances. So as a grandmother of 3 myself, I was now, not at the time I was writing my dissertation, but I was thrilled to see that her prose romance took up other generations of women than just the young lovers and gave women active roles and supportive roles for each other as friends. My first scholarly book about Mary Roth, titled Changing the Subject, broke new ground in focusing not on pairing Roth with canonical male authors, as, full confession, had my dissertation at Harvard on Roth and her uncle Philip Sidney, but on considering Roth's writings in relation to the women authors who were writing at the same time and who were mentored by her aunt, Mary Sidney Herbert. And it's many of those women authors that we read in my Smith course called Shakespeare's Sisters. My first novel about Roth received numerous regretful rejections, praising the quality of the writing, but explaining that there was no market data to support publication, meaning that no one had published a novel about her before. Circular reasoning for not publishing the first novel about this published woman author in Shakespeare's day. And here I want to share a little bit of some backstory about advice I received from one of my Smith colleagues, Carroll DeSanti, she was an editor at Penguin Random House when my agent was submitting my novel for publication. And she's a Smith alum. And she really liked the novel, but she said to me, Mary Roth is not well known by the wider public. And so I encourage you to write the next novel in your series that you're planning. Write that novel now and submit that to be the first novel in the series, because Mary Sidney Herbert, the character who is now the protagonist of my published novel, is better known than Mary Roth. And the reason for that, interestingly, is that Mary Sidney Herbert is a supporting character who appears in a series of vampire witch fantasy novels by Deborah Harkness called The Discovery of Witches. Some of you may know some of those. And because she's a walk-on character in this series that has magic and fantasy and vampires and witches, her name, she got a little bit of name recognition with the wider public. So Carroll DeSanti said to me, Carroll DeSanti being the editor who discovered Tracy Chevalier's Girl with a Pearl Earring and published it for the first time. So she's a very renowned kind of seminal woman editor who identified women fiction, historical fiction writers. And she said, Random House is a big publisher. They really want market data. And so I encourage you to write that next novel. I know that it's a little bit discouraging, that I can't offer you a contract on this novel, but I think that you'll do very well if you write that novel. So I wrote that novel being Imperfect Alchemist. I spent a couple years, I revised it, I sent it back, or my agent was going to send it back to Carroll. And at that point, Carroll had actually left publishing and decided she had written her own novel and she was interested in moving into other fields. In fact, right now she is a visiting guest lecturer in the English department teaching creative writing. So she had plenty of experience. And one of her Smith alum friends is Ruth Ozeki, one of my other colleagues who's currently a chaired professor in our English department. Ruth and Carroll were at Smith together. And Ruth said to me, I think you should follow Carroll's advice and write the novel about Mary Sidney Herbert next, because you can only publish your debut novel once. There's only one first novel that gets published, right? So you want to make sure it's the best novel that you can write. And writing your second novel will actually, you have all the experience of having actually written the first novel in draft. So you'll be all the more effective in writing your next novel. And that one, you'll know how to go back and revise the first novel. And that's exactly what happened. Because writing Imperfect Alchemist, which was then, at that point, my second novel, freed me, liberated me from, I knew what I was doing now. I knew how to write fiction because I'd already written a novel about a topic that I was actually the expert in, which made it harder to write a novel about because I knew too much. But writing about Mary Sidney Herbert, whose works I had read, who I taught in the classroom, but I'd not published multiple books on, scholarly books like Mary Roth, meant that I could invent. I could hear my characters and let them grow. And I will always be grateful for Carol DeSantis and Ruth Ozeki's advice, because following their advice, I wrote that novel. And my publisher is a British publisher in England, Allison and Busby, because no American publisher still has been willing to take a chance on a novel about a woman author in Shakespeare's time. It sounds pretty kind of like a minor subtopic to them. Wonderfully, a British independent publisher was delighted to take on the book. And so it's now actually coming out in paperback this month. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about Imperfect Alchemist, which is the novel that's out, and about Mary Sidney Herbert, its protagonist. As a member of one of England's leading families, Mary Sidney Herbert carved out space for herself as a daring and often controversial figure in a royal court riven by jealousies and intrigues. Her pioneering literary and scientific experiments, she was an alchemist, challenged many of Renaissance England's established conventions, and that was one of the qualities that really drew me to her. An influential literary patron as well as author, she convened a literary salon of writers whose membership included Edmund Spenser, John Donne, Ben Jonson, and other authors that we consider part of the English canon, interested in testing the limits of literary forms. Mary Sidney Herbert's own play about Antony and Cleopatra is believed to have influenced Shakespeare. And if you want to know more about that, you'll need to read my novel. So I was writing fiction. And sometimes the challenge for me as a novelist is to recognize that the story that matters to the wider public, and thus to editors and trade publishers, might not be the one that captures my attention as a scholar and a teacher. Some of what thrills me as a scholar teacher, such as Mary Sidney Herbert's ingenuity in employing 126 different stanzaic forms for her creative paraphrases of 107 psalms, which influenced the poetry of John Donne and George Herbert, might not grip the general reader. And in fact, my agent said to me, I quote some of Mary Sidney Herbert's poetry and some of Mary Roth's poetry in The Imperfect Alchemist. And he said to me, keep the verse quotes short, no longer than 3 lines, because trade publishers get nervous if it looks like you're putting too much verse into a fiction work. I'm not sure if that's still true, but I kept that in mind as I was writing. So responding to the Countess of Pembroke's role as a mentor to women writers, including Mary Roth, Amelia Lanier, Elizabeth Carey, and Anne Clifford, all of whom will play lead roles in my Shakespeare's Sisters series, I have imagined these women into her circle, their interaction with male authors, inspiring visions of new possibilities. In Imperfect Alchemist, the fictional Mary Sidney Herbert is mediated through my knowledge of her real life circumstances and her writings. She was also a scientist, practicing alchemy in her private laboratory to prepare chemical and herbal remedies. Although she was a well-regarded alchemist, no manuscript records of her alchemical recipes or experiments survive. And so, being a Renaissance scholar, I have drawn on historical accounts documenting the detailed practices of other female alchemists of the period to present an authentic, if conjectural, account of her scientific work. And I was able, thanks to many feminist scholars, to read the actual recipes of other early modern women's alchemy in her class, her upper class of society at that time. What did they make in their still rooms? As the acclaimed historical novelist Sarah Dunant, one of my favorites, observes, fashioning historical verisimilitude like a pointillist painting lies in the details. Indeed, Dunant describes historical details as gold dust, giving her readers confidence that they're encountering worlds that actually existed, and thus grounding the novel's inventions in a multicolored world. Pursuing a related line of thought, the historical and contemporary novelist Emma Donoghue observes that what biographical fiction does marvelously is to include, quote, the really peculiar detail, the detail that does not seem to fit, a kind of oddity that I might not have thought to make up, which makes for characters who are more rounded and three-dimensional than highly consistent invented ones often are. And in Imperfect Alchemist, some of those peculiar details include the Countess's initiation into shooting firearms and smoking tobacco, believe it or not. To lend a broader perspective than Mary's point of view alone, I introduce an invented character, Rose Common, her lady's maid, a country girl who brings an entirely different outlook to their intersecting lives. Trained to serve and observe, Rose proves to be both a keen judge of character and a skilled artist, whose drawings give new dimension to Mary's own life and writings. My construction of Rose is based on accounts of servants and country folk of the period. Fear of witchcraft was common, and that strand in my story incorporates historical examples of the treatment of women accused of sorcery. And I have a lot more I'd be happy to talk about as far as how I discovered Rose was an artist by looking at what she did when I was writing her story, that I can talk about more in the Q&A if anyone is interested. So in the novel, the supporting cast of characters, both real and invented, add three-dimensionality to the fictional storyline. Most of the characters in the book are fictional renditions of real historical figures, whose roles combine elements of their actual lives with my own inventions. Along with the authors in the literary circle and the courtiers in Mary's life, they include the court painter Marcus Geraerts the Younger, the physician, naturalist, and poet Thomas Moffat, the Countess's alchemical associate Adrian Gilbert, the proto-feminist Marie de Gournay from France, and John Dee, the most prominent occultist of his time and astrologer to the queen, at that time to the queen. The two central figures in the story are also drawn from life, two other central figures. Simon Foreman, who plays a key role in Rose's life, was an astrologer and herbalist who was apprenticed in his youth to a cloth merchant named Common. And Matthew Lister served the Dowager Countess of Pembroke as family physician and was rumored to be her much younger lover. So they show up in my novel. One of my guiding principles has been to avoid contradicting historical facts, but I've sometimes adjusted the timing of actual events by a couple months or years to serve the story and the narrative flow. Changing the subject was my first full-length study of Roth, and my two currently drafted novels about Mary Sidney Herbert and Mary Roth are the first fictional treatments of either of them. So one might say the time is long overdue to change the subject where Renaissance women authors are concerned. My favorite quote from Mary Roth's Urania occurs when one female character advises her friend about her unfaithful lover, "Say he hath left you, let him go in his own path, tread not in it. Another is more straight. Follow that, and be the empress of the world, commanding the empire of your own mind." I was bowled over when I read that. A Renaissance woman author talking about commanding the empire of your own mind. No Renaissance male author was writing words like that for a female character. And I read those words because there was no published edition. When I was in graduate school at Harvard in the 80s, there was no published edition of the continuation of Roth's Urania that she wrote by hand, right? There was only one manuscript copy of it in the Newberry Library in Chicago. So I traveled there on a fellowship to read her unpublished continuation in her own handwriting, and hundreds of pages, right? She was a voluminous author. And I will never forget the experience of sitting enthralled in the rare books room in the Newberry Library, reading these words in her handwriting. "Say he hath left you, let him go in his own path. Follow your own path and be the empress of the world, commanding the empire of your own mind." Writing those novels was when I learned that if you really want to change the subject, there's nothing like writing fiction about a subject on which you've become one of the international, quote, authorities, because that's when you'll be forced to recognize with consternation that all of your expertise can be as nothing, or actually pose obstacles to the story you're trying to tell. And my one side story about that is that I gave a version of this talk to a Harvard seminar, Zooming, in January. And one of the questions that I really appreciated was, if you could take one thing out of your toolbox as a scholar and academic that would remove it from your toolbox, that would make you a more effective novelist, what would it be? And that really made me think. And I realized the thing that I would get rid of is the notion of expertise, right? Because as a scholar, I'm trained to have facts, have proof for every allegation, every critical interpretation that I might make, right? I have to, especially as a female scholar working on a woman author, I've had to really defend my position as why I'm doing this and what my expertise is. So you learn in your training as a scholar to use your expertise as a shield, as armor sometimes, but as a novelist, if you can get rid of that, then you are free to listen to your characters and hear what they're trying to say and what they're trying to be, and let them speak. The most valuable advice that I received as a novelist came from Jennifer Carroll, a novelist and a scholar in her own right, who was actually in graduate school in the same program at Harvard as I was a couple years after me. And she reminded me that as a novelist, your responsibility is to the story, not to history. Just tell the story that matters. And Emma Donoghue observes that at its best, the biographical novel makes people uncomfortable because these characters stay different from us. We should keep that uncomfortable difference, which should provoke us. In my mind, it is precisely that uncomfortable difference that provoked early modern audiences to outrage. When the published words of women authors, they had to read them, and these women authors refused to play by the rules. That's the difference that can provoke modern audiences to wonder that such words could be spoken at that time, like the Empress of the World quote. Now I'd like to read you a very brief excerpt from my novel, Imperfect Alchemist, to demonstrate what I mean. There's a scene where Mary Sidney Herbert invites her young niece, Mary Roth, to read aloud from one of her own love sonnets, after the circle of male authors has been shaken by Amelia Lanier's more radical verses, another woman author of the time. Here's the excerpt. Following Amelia's example, Mary stood straight and tall during the Countess's introduction. Her red hair, sharing the family hue, was even curlier than her aunt's, and a few tendrils escaped their binding to tremble beside her cheeks. Seated close to the young woman, Mary glimpsed a sheen of sweat across her forehead. The sheet of paper in her goddaughter's hand trembled slightly, but when she opened her mouth, her voice was strong and clear. The poem she offered captured the anguish of disappointed love. False hope, which feeds but to destroy and spill what it first breeds, unnatural to the birth of thine own womb, conceiving but to kill. A love sonnet crafted around miscarriage. No male sonneteer would even think to convey the pain of love through one of women's most common experiences of death. The Countess saw several of the men shift uneasily and marveled to find greater discomfort on some faces than Amelia's more radical verses had produced. For them, the love sonnet was a familiar and reliable form, but not in this voice. Men were supposed to be the lovers, women the objects. Male sonneteers weren't concerned with women's experiences in love, only with their own successes or failures. So in that excerpt, you can see how I'm getting in my passions as a teacher of Renaissance women at Smith to the novel as well, in rendering Mary Sidney Herbert's response to hearing her niece, Mary Roth, read aloud a love poem. Writing my novel about Mary Sidney Herbert proved to be a voyage of discovery back to my novel about Mary Roth, which I'm currently in the process of revising now that, as of this week, the teaching semester is over. I turned in my grades on Monday. Following the publication of Imperfect Alchemist, I discovered that bringing the voices of these two women authors together was one of the stories that matter, not just to me, but to both novels and to the Shakespeare's Sisters series itself. So what's the story that matters in Imperfect Alchemist? Most of the novel is written from two alternating points of view, Mary's in the third person and Rose's in the first person. I can talk about more of that in the Q&A again, if you're interested. As I was writing, the story that came to matter the most was about both of these women, driven by sometimes conflicting imperatives of creative expression and desire. One, a quiet artist, the other, an outspoken author, who come to connect across cross lines, learning truths from each other that they never expected to discover about themselves and their world. And now you can see the paperback cover design for Imperfect Alchemist that's just been released. Imperfect Alchemist extends biofiction's traditional focus on a historical figure, supplemented by other historical figures whose paths they cross, by widening the lens. Not only does my narrative focus on the stories of two different women, one historical and one invented, but the story builds on a recurring image, the double Ouroboros, an alchemical figure that you can see on the cover of two snakes biting each other's tails in a circle, which celebrates the joining of opposites or the partnering of complementary forces. As the cover design for the novel suggests, with its black background of plants and berries surrounding the Ouroboros, Imperfect Alchemist explores the intertwining strands of herbalism and alchemy that run through the narrative and connect its two major characters. Now you see a vision of the Urania frontispiece, Mary Roth's published work. My aim has been to tell a story that imagines the perspectives of historical women in a world that encompasses both known facts and imagined possibilities, illuminating the historical record without being limited by it. I like to think that the real Mary Sidney Herbert, who reinterpreted the Psalms with her brother Philip, resurrected his prose romance Arcadia, and reinvented the figure of Cleopatra in her play Antonius, would appreciate my transmutation of her own story. The celebrated novelist Hilary Mantel maintains that you become a novelist so you can tell the truth, and observes that most historical fiction is in dialogue with the past. My driving aim is to tell the truth that becomes visible in these historical women's writings and to put my own fiction into dialogue with theirs. And I look forward to responding to any of your questions.
Thank you so much, Naomi. I'm going to add myself to the screen here so that I can see your face. And we have had several questions come in. I think I will start though with one that several people have sent in, which is they are really interested to learn more about Rose's character. You mentioned you might be willing to talk a little bit more about the genesis of that. So
great, right? Rose, who in some ways turned out to be many readers' favorite characters. It was really interesting to me because Rose was a completely invented character, right? And I remember after writing the draft of this novel, my agent getting it and reading it, and he said, "Now you're really a novelist." He said, "Rose is amazing, and your first novel, you were a scholar who wrote a very successful novel. That's the one about Roth that isn't published yet. But he said, with this novel, you're a novelist. You have created characters who live on the page. And Rose, I felt liberated in creating her character because Mary Roth and Mary Sidney, both of them, I knew them so well. I knew their work so well that I felt kind of obligated to my knowledge. And so in some ways, it was harder to get away and invent who they could be alive as characters in my novel. Rose, I used the first person voice. This is what I mentioned in the talk. I used the first person voice because I felt comfortable thinking into her world. What would she think when she meets this countess and has to be her maidservant? And what would she think about these stories? And so I got other perspectives on what the countess was doing because I have this working class character's perspective, listening to some of these stories, and this artist. So she drew illustrations for the countess. And these were things I had never thought of before about it. It gave me more insight, in fact, even into Mary Sidney Herbert's works from Rose's perspective, right? And one of my favorite experiences in the first part of writing this novel is I got so excited to listen to the voices of the characters that I would write all day. And then I'd go to bed that night and just think, when I wake up the next morning, what's going to happen in the story? Because I didn't know until I actually wrote it. And then I could hear them and see them interacting with each other. And so when Rose shows up, she's just a 9-year-old. She's brought to become a new maidservant. Her mother wants to protect her. Her mother has been charged with witchcraft. Her mother wants to put her in an educated woman's household so that her learning and her knowledge won't make her vulnerable the way many knowledgeable women were to charges of witchcraft. So Rose is nervous. She doesn't really want to go to this big house, to leave her own cottage in her own village. And so she's nervous and she has her little sack of belongings and she comes into the countess's presence. It's actually not the Countess Mary Sidney Herbert. It's the previous countess whose name was Catherine Herbert, because Henry Herbert had 3 wives, of which Mary Sidney Herbert was the third. Not a Bluebeard, but an interesting story. Anyway, so Rose comes into the Countess's of Pembroke's presence, and she's so nervous that she drops her sack and a bunch of her belongings spill out on the floor. And I remember as I was writing, looking to see, well, what was it that spilled on the floor? And I saw her baby brother's rattle, a little bell for her kitten, and some pieces of paper. I didn't know what was on them. Catherine Herbert says to Rose, "May I see those?" And Rose is thinking, oh no, what am I doing? She picks up the papers and looks at these papers and realizes these are her father's. Rose's father was a merchant. His accounting papers, on the back of which was blank space. And Rose used to sketch with charcoal, just her kitten, the plants in the garden. She used to sketch. And that was how I discovered that Rose was an artist, because I saw what spilled out of her bag. And it was so wonderful because it turns out in the novel that Rose's gift as an artist really complements and is part of that pairing with Mary Sidney Herbert's gift as an author, right? Mary Sidney Herbert's verbal and eloquent. Rose is quiet, but really observant and sees things that Mary Sidney Herbert completely misses, right? About the people around her. So it was really exciting for me to have a character that I could just let be herself, right? And that's kind of the backstory of Rose.
It's really interesting. I am not a writer myself, but thinking about the creation of art and or the creation of literature and stories. And it's interesting to hear you talk about how you yourself experienced it almost as a reader, as the story was evolving in your mind.
That's what it felt like. It really felt like, wow, okay, great. I get to write the next chapter. I get to find out what happens, because I don't believe in kind of blocking out every single thing in an outline. I knew what the historical facts were. Those were my frame, but I wanted my characters to get to know each other. Ruth Ozeki is one of the people who gave me great counsel as a novelist herself and said, listen to your characters, put them in a situation and see how they react, right? Because that's the most natural way to understand them. And I learned things about them that I would never have imagined. And I also got to kind of speak with their own voices.
So there were a few other questions too about who the other sisters in your series will be.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I'd love to mention them. So the next novel, which is now, as I said, I'm revising my very first novel. Now it will be my second novel in the series on Mary Roth, who has a lead, important role in Imperfect Alchemist. And I also now know a lot more about her world because I wrote that whole other novel, which is basically her world, right? So that will be the next novel, which I hope will be called something like Secret Story Maker, the sequel to Imperfect Alchemist. Then the novel after that will be Amelia Lanier, who was in the scene that I read you the excerpt from. Amelia Lanier was an amazing, what we'd consider proto-feminist poet, who wrote a long poem. It was based on a biblical story called Salve Deus Rex Judaeorum. But she had amazing characters in there, like the wife of Herod, who says to him, "You're a fool if you're thinking of crucifying the Christ," and speaks up very strongly. And some of the male authors in Mary Sidney Herbert's circle in my novel are very uncomfortable that a woman would speak that strongly. And Mary Sidney Herbert says, "What, you're going to defend Herod now?" And so it's interesting because I have these women who's had really strong voices in the Renaissance. They're all taught in my course, Shakespeare's Sisters at Smith, Mary Roth, Mary Sidney Herbert, Amelia Lanier, and two more women authors. One is Elizabeth Carey, whose play, The Tragedy of Marion, came out before Shakespeare's Othello. Interestingly, Shakespeare's Othello is a story where a jealous husband kills his wife, right? In The Tragedy of Marion, a jealous husband kills his wife, but it's the tragedy of Marion, not the tragedy of the husband, right? And it's brilliant. I mean, she in many ways was a proto-feminist herself. So her play, The Tragedy of Marion, is, and she, basically when she was a Catholic, and so she was persecuted for that. And when her husband tried to keep her almost like imprisoned in the house because he was a Protestant, she managed to escape. Her children she had shipped over across the continent, across the seas to France to be able to one of them became a monastic, one of them became a nun, and she was able to support her children. She was also very independent. Then one of the other novels will be about Anne Clifford, who wrote an amazingly voluminous diary and stood up to King James. By now, in the world of Mary Roth, who is the sequel, novel, Mary Roth was under King James, not Queen Elizabeth anymore. So there was a misogynist king, and that's why King James's courtier called Mary Roth a hermaphrodite for daring to write love poetry. How inappropriate for a woman to write love poetry, right? And a prose romance. He even said, "You should follow the example of your aunt, Mary Sidney Herbert, and write religious poetry," because at least she didn't write love poetry. She wrote psalms, right? So there's all sorts of stuff that happened at the court that I know that keeps occurring. And so all these women characters were in the same circle, right? They were in Mary Sidney Herbert's writing circle, and they met each other at court. And so you'll see recurring characters in the series who knew each other, these women authors. So that's why it's a world not just of the wives of Henry VIII, but of women in the Elizabethan and Jacobean courts who knew each other. And then actually my last novel in the series, I hope, will be about Queen Anna of Denmark, who was the wife of King James and who basically kept her own separate women's court with all these women, and she supported them. Her husband, King James, was a known misogynist, had a circle of male courtiers. He had many gay lovers in his time. And so she supported the women to such an extent that when Anne Clifford was trying to support her claims to her father's land, he had given her land, but her uncles were trying to take it away after her father died. She went to the Queen Anna, who said to Anne Clifford, and Anne Clifford records this in her diary, "The Queen told me not to trust my business to the king because he will not support me." And so to have the Queen married to the king giving that advice to one of her women courtiers about how to survive in this essentially kind of misogynist court, those are amazing details that I look forward to exploring. And in fact, my agent, one of his favorite characters is Queen Anna, who appears in the Mary Roth novel. So you'll first meet her there, but she'll reappear later in the series.
Okay. And I just want to answer a question's come in about, can we share some of these names and titles with the participants afterwards? And we're happy to do that. I will confer with Naomi.
Sure. In fact, what I can do is I have a little write-up of little very short paragraph blurbs for each of the novels in the series. So with the understanding that it is not, I don't have contracts for any of these books, so I really don't want to kind of have this be in any way getting out there widely, but I'd be happy to share just with the people who have, kind of listened to this presentation, the Smith alums, to keep, again, to not publicize, because you can only write the first novel about these women once. And I'm trying to, have it a market that is ready after Imperfect Alchemist to accept a series about these women, but not to have this get out like other people are saying, oh, well, okay, I'll write a novel about the fourth one in her series because it looks like she thinks that there's a market there. And, so that I'd be happy to share that.
Actually, sort of related to that, there was a question about your thoughts about the current spate of bestsellers related to Shakespeare, in particular Hamnet and Shakespeare in a Divided America. Do you have thoughts about, the success of those books?
Yes, I think I loved Hamnet. Maggie O'Farrell is an author who I'm actually in the process of reading her many novels, most of which are actually contemporary and not historical, just for her voice as an author. I think it was fascinating what she did with the idea of Shakespeare's wife and the loss of the child. Hamnet, pretty brilliant, right? It's very different from what I'm doing, but I really appreciated that. I think Shakespeare in a Divided America is very pertinent for us right now. And I find when I taught this semester, I taught Shakespeare's play in my Shakespeare class at Smith. I always teach Measure for Measure, which is basically Shakespeare's sexual harassment play. And when I taught it a few years ago, it was in the fall when Brett Kavanaugh was being confirmed. And we talked about Shakespeare's story of an unjust judge who sexually harasses Isabella, the nun, and she says, "I will proclaim thee." And he says, "Who will believe thee, Isabel?" And I said to my students, what did we just hear Christine Blasey Ford experience from Brett Kavanaugh? We are not 400 years. This is not some historical artifact that there was sexual harassment in the Renaissance. In our very current moment, there is sexual harassment. And I taught it as well during the year that Clarence Thomas was confirmed to the Supreme Court. So we have two current justices on the Supreme Court with credible cases of sexual harassment that were not addressed. Shakespeare's writing about this in Measure for Measure. And so Shakespeare in a Divided America, Shakespeare in our current America is completely relevant. And I always tell my students, you can bring in anything from, we don't live in a bubble. I mean, Smith seems like a bubble sometimes, but we are real people in the world. And Shakespeare has to be meaningful to us in our world. Just like there are many global Shakespeares right now being performed in different countries, which take the cultures of that country and incorporate that into the play. I am all for adaptations of Shakespeare. In my other class that Ashley mentioned, which is called Shakespeare's Women, Women's Shakespeares, we read Othello and King Lear and The Tempest, and then we read women authors' adaptations of those plays, including Toni Morrison, who wrote a play called Desdemona, that she decided, I've had it with Iago. He dominates the action of that play. I'm only going to write this if he can be, I take him out. So she told the story from after death experiences, because they all die at the end, right? Except Iago. So Othello, Desdemona, Emilia, who was killed by her husband, Iago. These are characters in Toni Morrison's story. Othello was like a child soldier. So that's the way she told his story. And just to see how women authors have reimagined Shakespeare gives us a new window into Shakespeare. And some of my Smithies in that class said, well, why can't we read these women authors when we're doing regular Shakespeare classes? And I said, well, it hadn't ever been done in the regular Shakespeare before, but I promise I will start doing that. So now in my regular Shakespeare class, we read an adaptation by a woman author at the end. I mean, we still need to cover at least 7 Shakespeare plays, but we read so that we can know what's our current relation to Shakespeare? How is Shakespeare relevant? And how do we change what we think about Shakespeare because we live in the current world?
There's a question, have the writings of any of the women you mentioned been published in the series, The Other Voice in Early Modern Europe? And also, what inspires you to write fiction rather than biography?
Okay, wait, could you say the first question again? Then I'll respond to it.
Sure. Have the writings of any of the women you mentioned been published in the series, The Other Voice in Early Modern Europe?
Oh, yes, that's a wonderful series. Not the women, that tends to focus on European women because there were actually far more women publishing in Europe than in England, which was one of the slowest of the countries to allow women to even publish or to women's voices to be heard. So that Other Voices series includes, for example, Veronica Franco, who is a featured character in my Mary Roth book. It's the next one. And she was a feminist Italian poet who wrote all sorts of brilliant poetry. And there is a different series that has published many of the works of these women authors. I can look up the publication data and include that in what I send to you for people who are interested. So you can read some of the works of these women. There are modern editions now. There's a modern paperback edition of Roth's poetry, which is wonderful, which I'm going to bring with me on retreat next week to start getting ready to work on the Roth novel again. Then the other question was about why I would write fiction instead of biography, right? Yes. Okay, so I've just brought to completion a collection of essays called Authorizing Early Modern European Women from biography to biofiction. And it's a collection of essays that's going to be published next year by University of Amsterdam Press, which is basically a series of essays about biofiction novels, some by novelists. So I write about writing Imperfect Alchemist. There are other people who write about novels and films and plays that have adapted the lives of these early modern European women, not just the English women, for the stage or for modern readers, because this is in fact a growing trend. One of the, and if you read that book, you'll see in the introduction that I co-authored, it talks about why do we do biofiction and what is biofiction? So biofiction is fiction that engages with a real historical character, but it was thought to be previously that historical fiction was meant to tell the story of the period and use the lead character as kind of a lens on that, but stay pretty close to what you think the period is. Whereas biofiction really focuses on bringing a character alive for a modern audience that might not want to read biography and might not really, historically, but might get interested in them if they're realizing that this was a living, breathing person. And some of the most effective biographies, of course, in fact, have an element of invention in them as well, because we don't have details or data for every single encounter between historical figures. We might have a letter describing something, a conversation between Hamilton and Washington, but we don't have both points of view. So the invention, basically Hamilton, the musical, the brilliant musical by Miranda, is biofiction, right? About Hamilton, but it made the whole period come alive, right? For a whole new audience, which is now people are reading biographies about Hamilton, about Washington, because of that. So my goal would be to have my readers of Imperfect Alchemist be so excited about meeting these women authors for the first time, the way that I do in my Smith class, that they go out and read more about them, and not just about them, but they read their works, because their works, again, as I said, are available in different editions now, all of which were not available in modern editions when I was in graduate school starting to write this. And so now I think back to that time and think, I'm amazed that I ever kind of managed to finish a dissertation about Mary Roth when there was no modern published edition of her works at all. And I had to go to Chicago to read it. And the 1621 edition, fortunately for me, there are about 8 copies of those in the world. One of them's at the Harvard Houghton Library. So I could read that at Harvard and go to Chicago to read the unpublished continuation. But it was pretty tough, right? Now there are modern editions. And
that was a question that came up for me, and then I saw it also in the Q&A about how, just the process of tracking down the original material, because you had mentioned at one point you went to Newberry Library to read one, and it just seems like it would have been a challenge to just to track some of this down. And
it was and that's the kind of treasure hunt part that I love about being a scholar and a teacher, right? Because you don't know what you're going to find, right? I when I was an undergraduate at Princeton, my professor, as I was graduating, getting ready to go to graduate school, said to me, when you get to Harvard, you should really look at Mary Roth. And I said, who is Mary Roth? And he said, Mary Roth was the niece of Sir Philip Sidney. And I said, okay, I will look at Mary Roth. Now, what I didn't say is, how is it that I went through 4 years as an undergraduate at Princeton and never learned about any women authors in the Renaissance? But thank goodness he told me at the end, look into Mary Roth. So I went to Harvard, I got my PhD. My advisor has become one of the leaders, my late advisor, Barbara Lewalski, was a leading Milton scholar who did work on early modern women as well. And so when I knew I wanted to look at Mary Roth, I hadn't read her because there were no modern editions. So when I knew I had to apply for a fellowship to go to the Newberry Library in Chicago, I didn't know what I was going to find in reading these handwritten pages that I'm reading her handwriting. I had no idea. I'm sitting there, I was enthralled. I literally couldn't move. I would get up, maybe the Newberry Library was only open limited hours, say, 8 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon or something. I would hardly get up at all. I would, not eat during the day at all because I couldn't waste a moment. I only had, whatever the couple weeks that I had on the fellowship to read this manuscript. And you had to, at that point, write transcriptions in pencil on paper. You weren't allowed to use laptops because they were considered, this is true of the British Library too. When I did research, it was considered too modern. This is what happens when you're getting your PhD in the late 80s, right? And so I had these handwritten notes in my handwriting, in pencil, trying to transcribe Mary Roth's handwriting. I mean, it's amazing. I could even read some of this stuff after the fact. It wasn't that legible. But then the excitement, I just felt, this aha moment, like, I can't believe that she wrote this, that she said you could be the empress of the world, commanding the empire of your own mind. That internal cognitive empire. This is being written in the 1620s by a woman author who's been chucked out of the court for writing a prose romance, period. And it did not shut her up. She wrote hundreds more pages. And so when I had this discouraging multiple years where my Roth novel, my agent loved it, he kept submitting it to publishers. They were saying, we don't really see a market. And I thought, well, I'm not going to give up. Mary Roth didn't give up, so it took 400 years before her novel came out in a modern edition. Hopefully it won't take me that long. And, maybe just 4 years. But, I was not going to give up. They continued, and I was resolved I would continue. And that's true also of finding an American publisher, which in a little, you may be interested to know that Imperfect Alchemist came out in the UK in last November 2020. My publisher there has only UK and Commonwealth rights, which don't include Canada. So it's Australia, it comes out in the UK. No American bookstore can stock it. That's why you need to order it online if you're interested. And it's now in paperback through my author website. Before the book was even published, an Italian publisher had already bought the contract to it and was starting the translation. The publisher of The Kite Runner in Italy has bought the contract for Imperfect Alchemist, which will be coming out in Italy in November. Meanwhile, my American agent has still found no American publisher willing to take what seems this fairly, kind of abstruse minor woman figure, even though she's a woman author published in the time of Shakespeare. Wouldn't that be interesting, I think, to a modern audience, especially because women are the majority of purchasers of historical fiction? But it's a long road. But every time I get discouraged, I think about Mary Roth and hundreds of pages in her handwriting. She was not shut up. Neither will I be.
Good. Well, it's almost 1 o'clock, so we probably have time for one more question. Maybe a good one to end on. This is not sure actually how quickly you'd be able to answer this, but it was a question about how you decided to bridge the English language of the time of your characters with today.
Yes, that is a very good question. And it was definitely a challenge for me. And part of how I did it was by writing Mary Sidney Herbert's voice in the third person, because I felt that I had read her writings and I felt uncomfortable kind of taking over the first person voice for her. Yeah, I'm getting more and more comfortable with that now that I've had Rose in the first person, so that maybe for Amelia Lanier, the third novel in the series, I may use the first person. But part of what I was resolved to do was not try to use modern anachronistic language for them. But in fact, the wonderful thing is that Shakespeare, much of our English language was actually invented by Shakespeare's words, so that I knew that I would be telling it using contemporary language, but any key term that was anachronistic that only started being used in the 18th century, the 19th century, I took it out. So I use the OED online from the Smith-Nielsen Library website every day as a writer to make sure, okay, when was the first provenance? Oh, okay, I'm writing in the 1600s. This word didn't get used until the 18th century. I'm not going to use it. I would have to find a correlate because I didn't want there to be anachronistic words. But I also knew that I wanted modern readers to feel comfortable reading the prose and not feel as if I'm writing in Elizabethan thee, thou speech or something like that. Because also, as one of the women writers who wrote to me about this commented, the published works by authors often were in more formal language than how they would speak to each other. So how they would speak to each other, I felt, I know I've taught Shakespeare's plays for 35 years. I know how his characters speak to each other. I wasn't nervous I was interviewed for a podcast on women in Shakespeare by a wonderful British podcaster. And she asked that same question. I said, I felt that I knew Shakespeare's voice through all his lively characters. So I could actually feel that I could put words in his mouth, for short conversations with the Countess of Pembroke and not feel uncomfortable doing that.
Well, thank you so much. And I know we're right at about 1 o'clock. And thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your reunion. Thank you, Naomi. Thank you. And we will see you all soon. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.